April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, and April Fool's Day. The cynical among us thought it was a fitting date for the invasion of Okinawa. We stood on the decks of the transport ships and looked out at the ocean. It was no longer water, it was steel. The invasion fleet was the largest armada ever assembled in the history of the world, surpassing even D-Day in Normandy. WWII 500 ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, landing craft. It looked like you could walk from Okinawa to Hawaii on the decks of the ships. We were the 10th Army, a massive force of Army and Marine divisions combined. We called the landing L-Day. Some joked it stood for Love Day. We expected a slaughter on the beaches. Okinawa was the doorstep of Japan, only 350 miles from the mainland. We knew they would defend it with everything they had. The naval bombardment was apocalyptic. For days, the battleships Tennessee, Maryland, and West Virginia poured 14-inch shells onto the island. The sound was a continuous rolling thunder that vibrated through the hulls of our ships. We watched the island disappear under a shroud of smoke and dust. We climbed down the cargo nets into the Higgins boats, stomachs churning with seasickness and fear. We prayed. We checked our rifles. We waited for the ramp to drop and the machine guns to open up. But when the ramp dropped, nothing. Silence. No machine guns. No mortars. No banzai charges. We walked onto the Hagushi beaches standing up. We moved inland. We captured the airfields of Yontan and Kadena within hours. By the end of the day, we had landed 60,000 men without a major fight. We looked at each other. Where are they? It felt like a prank, an April Fool's joke. The veterans of Peleliu and Iwo Jima didn't smile. They knew. They knew that General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese commander, was too smart to fight on the beaches. He had pulled back. He had ceded the north. He had ceded the beaches. He was waiting for us in the south. As we moved inland, we saw something we hadn't seen in a long time. People, civilians. Okinawa wasn't a barren rock. It was a prefecture of Japan. There were villages, farms, schools, and there were 400,000 civilians trapped between two massive armies. We saw old women carrying bundles. We saw terrified children peering out from behind stone walls. It added a new layer of horror to the war. We weren't just killing soldiers anymore. We were invading a home. We marched south, the spring air cool and pleasant. The cherry blossoms were starting to fall. It felt like a walk in the country. Then, we hit the Kakizu Ridge, and the walk ended. The trap was sprung. Suddenly, the hills opened up. The Typhoon of Steel began, but this time the steel was coming at us. General Ushijima had built his defense around the ancient Shuri Castle. It was a network of ridges, escarpments, and ravines that ran across the island like a jagged scar. We called it the Shuri Line. It wasn't a line on a map. It was a meat grinder. Every hill was a fortress. Every ridge was honeycombed with tunnels and reverse-slope artillery positions. They had 150mm howitzers that could slide out of a cave, fire, and slide back in before we could spot them. They had the Screaming Mimis, massive 320mm spigot mortars. You could see the shell coming through the air, tumbling end over end like a garbage can, screaming like a banshee. When it hit, it didn't just explode, it erased an entire squad. We threw ourselves against the Shuri Line. The army on the left, the Marines on the right. We fought for hills with names like Sugar Loaf, the Pinnacle, and Conical Hill. We would take a hill in the morning, lose it in the afternoon, and take it again at night. And then the heavens opened. The plum rains began. It didn't just rain, it poured, for weeks. It was a deluge that turned Okinawa into a swamp of gray glue. The mud was everywhere. It was deep enough to swallow a boot, then a wheel, then a tank. Roads disappeared. Supply trucks bogged down. We had to airdrop food and ammo because we couldn't get vehicles to the front. We lived in the mud. We slept in the mud. We ate in the mud. And the dead. The dead were buried in the mud, only to be washed up again by the artillery. The battlefield became a landscape of rot, The smell was unbearable. Maggots were everywhere. We were fighting in a soup of decomposing bodies and sewage. I remember trying to sleep in a foxhole filled with water. My skin was turning white and wrinkled from trench foot. I was shaking with cold. And all night long, the Japanese artillery pounded us. Boom, 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 a ceaseless rhythm. They call it shell shock for a reason. Your brain starts to rattle inside your skull. You stop talking. You stop thinking. You just stare. We saw men crack. Good men. Brave men. They would just start crying and couldn't stop. Or they would walk out into the open fire just to make it end. We were stuck. We couldn't move forward. We couldn't go back. We were just churning the mud with our blood, waiting for the sun that never seemed to shine. Oh, and while we were drowning in the mud, out at sea, the Navy was facing its own version of hell. The Kamikazes were coming. By mid-May, the battle had stalled. We were no longer measuring gains in miles, but in yards. The 6th Marine Division was tasked with taking a small, insignificant-looking mound of earth on the western flank. It was barely 50 feet high and 300 yards long. It looked like nothing. The map called it Sugar Loaf Hill. But looks were deceiving. Sugar Loaf wasn't just a hill. It was the anchor of the entire Japanese western defense. And it was a trap of diabolical genius. General Ushijima had built a kill box. Sugar Loaf was supported by 2 other hills, the Horseshoe and the Half Moon. They formed a triangle. If you attacked Sugar Loaf, the Japanese on the Horseshoe and Half Moon would shoot you in the back. If you attacked the flanks, the guns on Sugar Loaf would cut you down. It was a crossfire designed by engineers and perfected by killers. On May 12th, the Marines stepped off. They ran up the slope. It seemed easy. But as soon as they reached the crest, the world exploded. Hidden mortars on the reverse slope opened up. Machine guns from the neighboring hills raked the summit. The Marines were slaughtered. They were blown off the hill. They tried again, and again, and again. For 7 days, the 6th Marine Division threw itself at Sugar Loaf. 11 separate assaults. Tanks tried to flank the hill, but they were hit by 47mm anti-tank guns hidden in caves. We watched the tanks burn, the crews screaming inside, the metal glowing cherry red in the gloom. The infantry had to do it alone. It became a brawl. Marines would reach the top, jump into a Japanese trench, and fight with knives, shovels, and bare hands. I saw a Marine grab a Japanese grenade midair and throw it back. I saw men using dead bodies as sandbags because the mud was too liquid to stack. Companies were reduced to platoons. Platoons were reduced to squads. The hill changed hands 4 times in one day. The mud turned red. It wasn't a metaphor. The blood mixed with the clay and the rain until the entire slope was a slick, crimson slide. When we finally took Sugar Loaf for the last time, there was nothing left to celebrate. The hill was just a pile of churned earth and corpses. The 6th Marine Division had suffered 2,600 casualties for a mound of dirt you could walk across in 2 minutes. While the Marines were bleeding on Sugar Loaf, the U.S. Army 77th and 96th Divisions were facing their own nightmare in the center of the line, the Maida Escarpment. We called it Hacksaw Ridge. It wasn't a hill. It was a cliff, a sheer vertical wall of rock rising 400 feet out of the jungle. To get to the enemy, the soldiers had to climb. They threw cargo nets, heavy rope nets usually used for unloading ships, over the side of the cliff. We climbed those nets like spiders, with 60 pounds of gear on our backs, rifles slung over our shoulders. All the while, the Japanese were at the top, dropping grenades, cutting the ropes, firing down at us. If you fell 400 feet onto the rocks. When we finally pulled ourselves over the lip of the cliff, we entered a moonscape. The Japanese were dug into caves on the reverse slope. They would wait until we advanced, then pop out of the ground behind us. It was here that the legend of the medic was born. Private First Class Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector, a man who refused to touch a gun because of his religious beliefs. The other soldiers had mocked him in training. They called him a coward, but on Hacksaw Ridge, they stopped laughing. During a massive Japanese counterattack, the order was given to retreat. The Americans scrambled back down the cargo nets, but Doss stayed, alone, on the top of the cliff, with the enemy swarming around him. He crawled through the mud, dragging the wounded men one by one to the edge of the escarpment. He tied a rope around them and lowered them down the 400-foot drop to safety. He did this all night. Every time he lowered a man, he prayed, "Lord, please help me get one more." He saved 75 men that night. He was wounded by a grenade, then shot in the arm, but he never picked up a weapon. He was the only bright spark in a world of absolute darkness. But for most of us, there were no miracles, just the grind. We pushed past Hacksaw. We pushed past Sugar Loaf. We entered the ruins of Shuri Castle, the ancient capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom. It had walls of stone 20 feet thick. The battleships Mississippi and New York pounded it for days. When we finally walked into the courtyard, the castle was gone. It was just rubble. But underneath the rubble, the Japanese headquarters was empty. Ushijima had done it again. He had slipped away in the rain. He had retreated to the southern tip of the island, to the cliffs of Mabuni. He was dragging the war out. He was forcing us to kill him inch by inch. And as we moved south, the civilians, the Okinawan people, were caught in the crossfire. The tragedy was about to reach its peak. While the infantry was drowning in the mud of the Shuri Line, the sailors of the Fifth Fleet were facing a different kind of horror on the open ocean. The Japanese knew they couldn't stop us on the ground, so they decided to kill the fleet that supported us. They unleashed the Kamikaze, the divine wind. It wasn't just a few fanatical pilots anymore. It was an organized industrial-scale suicide strategy. Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. They launched waves of 300, 400 planes at a time. Zeros, Vals, Judys, even old biplane trainers made of wood and canvas. They stripped them of radios and landing gear. They bolted a 500-pound bomb to the belly, and they gave the pilots a cup of sake and a one-way ticket to hell. The primary targets were the aircraft carriers and battleships, but the men who suffered the most were the sailors on the radar picket ships. These were destroyers stationed 50 miles out from the main fleet to provide early warning. They were the sentries, and they were the first things the Kamikazes saw. Life on a picket ship was a 24-hour nightmare. You couldn't sleep. You lived in your life jacket and helmet. The radar screen was a glowing green eye that you stared at until you went blind. Then, the blips would appear. Raid 1, bearing 350, range 20 miles, speed 200. The klaxon would scream, "Gong, gong, gong. General quarters, man your battle stations." You would run to your 40mm Bofors or your 20mm Oerlikon gun. You would look up at the sky, straining to see them in the sun. Then they would dive. They didn't fly like normal pilots. They didn't jink or weave. They flew in a straight, steady line, right down the throat of your gun. You would fire. The sky would fill with black puffs of flak. You would see pieces of the plane fly off, a wingtip, a piece of the tail. The plane would catch fire, but it wouldn't stop. A burning plane is just as deadly as a flying one. The pilot was dead, but the machine was still coming. I remember the USS Laffey. They called it the ship that would not die. In 80 minutes, she was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. She was burning from stem to stern. Her guns were jammed. Her decks were slippery with blood and oil. But her sailors kept firing pistols and rifles at the planes until the water finally claimed the attackers. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors started to crack. They couldn't handle the idea of fighting an enemy who wanted to die. It violated every instinct of warfare. But the Japanese had one card left to play. The biggest card in the deck. The Yamato. The largest, most powerful battleship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel. 9 18-inch guns that could fire a shell weighing as much as a car over 26 miles. She was the pride of the empire. The symbol of Japan's soul. On April 6th, she set sail for Okinawa. Her mission was Operation 10 Go. It was a suicide mission. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was madness. The Yamato was to beach herself on the coast of Okinawa, turn into a massive, unsinkable fortress, and use her guns to destroy the American landing fleet until her ammunition ran out. Then, her crew would charge ashore to fight as infantry. But she never got there. American submarines spotted her. The carriers launched everything they had. On April 7th, 300 American aircraft swarmed the giant ship like angry bees. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Yamato had no air cover. She was alone. Her massive guns were useless against planes buzzing around her bridge. She fought back with 150 anti-aircraft guns, turning the sky into a curtain of lead. But there were too many torpedoes. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into her port side. Bombs ripped open her decks. Inside the ship, it was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The lights went out. The ship began to list heavily. Water rushed in, drowning thousands of sailors trapped below decks. At 14:23, the Yamato capsized. As she rolled over, her magazines detonated. The explosion was so massive, it was seen by sailors on ships 100 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 20,000 feet into the air. The Yamato took 3,000 men to the bottom with her. With her death, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist. The divine wind had failed. The giant was dead. But on Okinawa, the rain was still falling, and the dying hadn't stopped. By June 1945, the Shuri Line had finally broken. The Iron Typhoon had ground the Japanese 32nd Army into dust. But General Ushijima did not surrender. He did something worse. He ordered a retreat to the southern tip of the island, to the Kiamu Peninsula. It was a march of the damned. Tens of thousands of soldiers, wounded and starving, mixed with over 100,000 terrified civilians. They were all fleeing south, away from the Americans, towards the sea. But the island ends. There was nowhere left to run. They were squeezed into a tiny corner of jagged coral and cliffs called Mabuni. The weather had cleared, but the mud remained. The roads were clogged with carts, animals, and bodies. American aircraft prowled the skies, strafing anything that moved. But the real tragedy wasn't the military defeat. It was the psychological victory of the imperial propaganda machine. For years, the Okinawan people had been told a terrible lie. They were told that the Americans were monsters, demons. They were told that if captured, the men would be crushed by tanks, and the women would be raped and murdered. The Japanese army handed out grenades to civilians, not to fight with, but to kill themselves. They were told, "It is better to die by your own hand than to be captured by the American devils." And so, as the U.S. Marines and Army troops slowly closed the net around Mabuni, a wave of mass hysteria swept through the caves. Fathers looked at their children and made the impossible choice. Mothers looked at their babies and wept. Inside the damp, dark caves, entire families gathered in circles. They pulled the pins on the grenades. Thump, thump, thump. The sounds of muffled explosions came from underground, one after another, like a heartbeat stopping. We found them later. Whole generations, grandparents, parents, children, lying together in the darkness. It was a scene that broke the hearts of the toughest combat veterans. We had come to liberate them, but our presence had driven them to extinction. By mid-June, the survivors were pushed to the very edge of the island. The cliffs at Mabuni rise 100 feet straight out of the churning Pacific Ocean. Sharp, jagged coral dropping into the blue water. What happened there is something that no man who saw it will ever forget. We stood on the ridges, looking down through binoculars. We saw thousands of civilians gathered on the cliff edge. We set up loudspeakers. We brought in Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans, to beg them to stop. Please, do not jump. We have food, we have water, we will not hurt you. The interpreters shouted until their voices were hoarse. They cried into the microphones. Some civilians hesitated. They looked at us. They saw we weren't shooting. They saw us holding out cans of peaches and water. But then Japanese soldiers, hiding among the civilians, would shoot those who tried to surrender. Or they would push them. Or the fear was simply too deep. I watched a woman, a mother, standing on the precipice. She was holding a baby in her arms. She combed the baby's hair.
All right,
She wrapped it in a blanket.
Next group,
Then
over here.
she stepped off the edge. She didn't scream. She just fell. turning over and over in the wind until she hit the rocks below. Then another jumped, and another. It became a waterfall of humanity. Old men, schoolgirls in uniforms, entire groups holding hands. They jumped into the sea. The water turned crimson. We stood there, the conquerors, the victors, and we felt utterly defeated. We fired our rifles into the air to try to stop them. We threw smoke grenades to screen them from the Japanese soldiers, but we couldn't stop the ideology that had driven them to this. It was a collective suicide on a scale the world had never seen since ancient times. It was the death of a culture. I remember a young Marine next to me, a kid who had killed a dozen enemy soldiers without blinking at Sugar Loaf. He sat down in the grass and wept openly. He said, "Why? Why are they doing this?" There was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the bodies on the rocks. On June 22nd, deep in a cave overlooking the sea, General Mitsuru Ushijima prepared for the end. He wore his full dress uniform. He had eaten a final meal. He turned to his chief of staff, General Cho, and said, "The time for parting has come." They knelt on a white sheet facing north, towards the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. A mixture of water and sake was poured. They drank. Then, in the flickering candlelight, General Ushijima drew his blade. He performed the ritual of seppuku. He cut his own stomach, and his aide beheaded him. The Battle of Okinawa was over, but the shadow of Okinawa stretched far beyond the island. In Washington, D.C., President Harry Truman was reading the casualty reports. The numbers were staggering. 12,500 Americans killed, 36,000 wounded. The Navy had lost 36 ships and nearly 5,000 sailors to the Kamikazes. And the Japanese, 110,000 soldiers killed, and perhaps 150,000 civilians dead, a third of the island's population. The military planners looked at these numbers and did the math. If taking a small island like Okinawa cost 250,000 lives, what would it cost to invade the main islands of Japan? They predicted Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, would cost 1 million American casualties and 10 million Japanese lives. They looked at the cliffs of Mabuni. They saw how the civilians jumped rather than surrender. They realized that invading Japan wouldn't be a battle, it would be a national suicide. Okinawa convinced the world that Japan would never surrender as long as they had a single bamboo spear left. And so, the decision was made. To stop the killing, they had to unleash the sun. 2 months after the guns fell silent on Okinawa, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima. The cloud that rose over that city was fueled by the blood spilled on Sugar Loaf, Hacksaw Ridge, and the Suicide Cliffs. Okinawa was the fuse that detonated the atomic bomb. Today, the southern tip of Okinawa is a park, the cornerstone of peace. It is a beautiful place. Black granite walls wind through the green grass, looking out over the blue ocean. Engraved on those walls are the names of everyone who died: Americans, British, Japanese, Okinawans, soldiers and civilians, generals and babies. There are no sides there, just names, over 240,000 of them. When you walk there, the wind blows from the sea. It is quiet, but if you listen with your heart, you can still hear the echo. You can hear the thunder of the battleships, the scream of the kamikazes, the weeping of the mothers on the cliffs. Okinawa was the Typhoon of Steel. It was the final storm of the greatest war in human history. It taught us the ultimate lesson. In total war, there are no winners. There are only survivors. This concludes our series on the Battle of Okinawa. It has been a journey through the darkest valley of the Pacific War. Thank you for walking this path with us on Beneath the Metal. Never forget the price of peace. Semper Fi.